One of the things that we take a look at when we are talking about biogeochemical cycles is the ecosphere. The ecosphere is a pretty general term because the ecosphere actually encompasses all of these different pieces here. So the lithosphere, which is the terrestrial, the atmosphere, which is the air-based component, the hydrosphere, which is of course the water-based component or part of the planet. And so in the middle here we have the biosphere. And so the biosphere is made up of the lithosphere, the atmosphere, and the hydrosphere, and then all of that together is actually the ecosphere. All life on the planet is considered to be biotic, and the ecosphere is actually considered all of the interactions between the biotic, which is the living part of the ecosystem, and the abiotic, which is the non-living part of the ecosystem. The ecosphere's interactions can be subdivided into these three structural zones, like we already talked about. So we have the atmosphere, which includes all of the interactions in the air, the hydrosphere, which is the interactions in the water, and the lithosphere, which is the interactions on the land. The lithosphere is the solid outer part of the Earth, so we would think of that as the Earth's crust. The lithosphere is also concerned with the interactions between the biotic, so the living and the non-living parts of the environment. And there's three key biotic processes that play a role in the cycling of matter on Earth. So remember our law of conservation of matter. Matter is neither created nor destroyed. It just will change form. So the processes involved in the cycling of matter throughout the ecosphere are photosynthesis and cellular respiration, which we've discussed already in previous units, and also decomposition, which is the mechanism by which organisms like bacteria and fungi will break down organic matter and convert it into nutrients that can be used by other organisms. So when we break down the ecosphere into its different component parts, we're going to start with the atmosphere, which we kind of said is the interaction of all of the living and non-living things in the air. Now, one really important concept when it comes to the atmosphere is that the atmosphere wasn't always like it is today, which is an oxygen-based atmosphere. At one time, it actually was what we call a reducing atmosphere because it was actually hydrogen-based, not oxygen-based. Now, because oxygen is necessary for the vast majority of living things, the fact that we once had a hydrogen-based atmosphere really restricted the amount of life that we could actually have on the planet. So one of the key organisms in the emergence of our planet and life on our planet is something called cyanobacteria. So as the name implies, it is a type of bacteria, but what makes this type of bacteria particularly special is that they actually, when they underwent their metabolic reactions, okay, remember those are the processes that are necessary for life, they actually started to produce oxygen. So previous to that, there really wasn't a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere, limiting life. But once the cyanobacteria emerged millions of years ago, we started to produce oxygen, and the planet actually kind of was like, hey, now we can have a little bit more life here. So now we have an oxidizing atmosphere, not a reducing atmosphere. And of course, the increase in those oxygen levels on the planet is what set the stage for new and various life forms. So in terms of our timeline, this cyanobacteria event was about 2.5 billion years ago. So extremely long time ago. And the cyanobacteria, when we find fossil evidence of the cyanobacteria, carbon dating has been done to establish that number of 2.5 billion years. So they determined this by iron oxides that actually were in ancient rock layers, okay, ancient strata. And so iron oxides were formed when iron in the rock beds actually combined with free oxygen to create like a black type of band in the rocks. So that's how paleontologists have actually established that 2.5 billion year time cycle. So the hydrosphere, of course, is the water, and of course all of the interactions between the biotic and the abiotic that occur in the water, okay? So one of the main components that we have to think about when we think about the hydrosphere is the hydrological cycle, more commonly known as the water cycle. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I know that most of these terms that are in the water cycle you have already studied in previous years, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. One of the important things to just remember is that water, of course, is essential to the survival of biotic systems, rather, because of its very specific properties, which we'll talk about later. But you need to know the meaning of the circled terms on this slide. So in other words, condensation, of course, is the conversion of water from liquid to vapor. Transpiration is the movement of water from plant leaves right into the atmosphere. Precipitation is the opposite of condensation, so that's going from vapor to water. And remember that precipitation can be any type of water, so that can be snow, that can be water, that can be hail, sleet, whatever, okay? And then surface runoff, of course, is the movement of water into other bodies of water as it runs off surfaces, agricultural land, etc. And then, of course, evaporation. Everybody kind of knows what that means. Evaporation is the conversion, of course, of liquid water back into the condensed form or into clouds. So just make sure that you feel rather comfortable with the different terms and processes associated with the water cycle. One of the concepts that is fairly prominent in the program of studies, actually at all levels, so we see this in Science 10, Biology 20, Biology 30, are these properties of water. So be fully prepared to see these on a unit exam, district exam for ecology, because they're very, very prominent, and they're also one of those things that kind of follows us up through the different levels of science. So water has very unique properties that make it very different from other substances on Earth, and it, of course, is necessary for life to exist. So one of the first significant differences between water and other substances are both the boiling point and the freezing point of water. So if you kind of think about boiling points versus freezing point, I hope you remember that boiling point of water is 100 degrees Celsius. And then, of course, the freezing point and the melting point, weirdly, is 0 degrees Celsius. So sometimes kids are like, how can it freeze and melt at the same temperature? And really what that has to do with is it just has to do with what solutes there are in the water, and of course what other climatic conditions are like. So is there wind, is there humidity, etc. So at 0 degrees Celsius you actually have water kind of toggling back and forth between its solid and its liquid form. Okay, the other thing that is very important in terms of water and its implications for the planet are its very high specific heat capacity. This is something that we learned in Science 10. Don't know if you remember that or not, but in any case, specific heat capacity, when it's high, basically means that the water takes a really long time to heat up, but it also takes a really long time to cool down. So you can think of it if you've ever visited a lake or whatever in the summer, and if you go swimming in the early summer, the water is still like totally freezing cold, but if you go like late August, the water actually is pretty warm. So what implications does this have for life on our planet? Basically, if water were really easy to freeze or boil, so if it was at like 21 degrees Celsius that it like froze or boiled or whatever, can you imagine if the water was like 21 degrees Celsius, if it boiled, what would happen to all the living things? So these extremes in temperatures, that 100 degrees and 0 degrees Celsius, are very important for the things that live in our lakes and our oceans. And this is also why sweat is able to cool our bodies when we are trying to maintain homeostasis of body temperature. Now, the next two things, the surface tension, also known as adhesion, and the cohesion, these are two things that kids quite often get a little bit confused. So make sure you spend some time on these, because it's a very common question to see if you understand the difference between the two. So surface tension adhesion, besides mercury, the element mercury, water actually has the highest surface tension of all liquids on the planet. And what this basically means is that it has a high surface tension because of the hydrogen bonding that we have in water molecules, okay? So cohesion, on the other hand, is the intermolecular forces between molecules. So this is why water molecules are able to hold themselves together in a droplet. So if you think of like water drops on like a window or the top of a rooftop of a car or whatever, hood of a car, water molecules are very cohesive because of the molecule's polarity. And remember what the polarity means. It means that the water molecules have a slightly positive end and a slightly negative end. So this is why you can fill rather a glass of water up to the very, very top and without actually it over spilling or flowing over, okay, because those molecules are attracted to each other, okay. Continuing with the properties of water, we're going to talk a little bit about the solid state. And this is a very important one in terms of implications for life on the planet, and the universal solvent piece, which is also very important for implication in terms of implications for life on the planet. So in terms of the solid state, it is typical for substances, as you guys know with your study of chemistry, to expand when they are heated and to contract when they are cooled. So all substances, including water, are going to become less dense when they're heated and denser when they are cooled. So that's true for all substances, but where water is very different from other substances is this is only true to a certain point, and then water begins to act what we call abnormally. So water is one of the few substances whose solid state will actually float on its liquid state. And if you think about that, anytime you've ever put ice cubes into a glass of water or a glass of iced tea or whatever, the ice cubes always float. And that's because water will become less dense as it is cooled until about 4 degrees Celsius. After 4 degrees Celsius, and remember, the freezing point of water is 0 degrees Celsius. So once it cools below 4 degrees Celsius, it actually becomes less dense. And that's very, very significant in terms of implications for life on the planet. So example, I want you to think of like a lake. So here's my awesome lake, and there's the water, okay? And I want you to think about wintertime in any lake in Alberta. If water acted the same way that other liquids do, and it continued to be more and more and more dense as it cooled, what would happen is the lake would freeze from the bottom up. And I want you to think what would happen there in the winter. So you'd continue to get these layers of frozen ice pushing all of the organisms up to the top, like the fish and everything. The plants would be frozen at the bottom. Okay, obviously not very conducive for sustaining life over winter. So what actually happens, so here's my other little lake, what actually happens, of course, is once the water freezes, it actually is less dense. And so you get that layer of ice on the surface that you skate on or go ice fishing or skidooing or whatever. And then all of the life underneath that layer of ice is nice and cozy under here while they wait out the winter months. So very important in terms of implications for life in bodies of water. We're going to skip over the liquid state because all that really talks about is that it's really rare for water to be liquid at room temperature. Most substances are not. So if you were to look into your chemistry guides about like freezing points and boiling points of other types of liquids, water is very unusual in that it's going to be liquid at that room temperature of 21 degrees Celsius. The other majorly important characteristic of water that we've talked about a little bit already is the fact that it is called the universal solvent. And remember what a solvent is. A solvent is something that dissolves other substances, and universal just implies that water is a very, very good solvent. So in other words, lots of things will dissolve in water, including sugar, including salt, etc., etc. And the reason why water is a good solvent is because of its polarity. And remember what that means. Water has a slightly positive end and it has a slightly negative end. And what this allows it to do is attract different kinds of molecules and pull those molecules apart until they're dissolved. So the slightly negative and slightly positive polarity of water allows it to dissolve lots of substances. Now, in terms of implications for life, what is the whole point of a universal solvent and how does that help living things? In the natural world, it obviously allows for a lot of materials to be dissolved in water. So you can think of nutrients, you can think of minerals, right? So lots of things will dissolve in natural bodies of water, salt, etc., and salt water. Okay, so that's very, very important. The other important thing, though, is what water, because of its properties in terms of the universal solvent, actually does in our bodies. So water, remember, allows us to digest. It allows us to break down molecules through hydrolysis. It allows us to dissolve water-soluble materials like vitamin C, for example. Okay, so very, very important in terms of that property for life on the planet. So when we talk about cycling of matter, just keep in mind that we're talking about the movement of matter through those different parts of the ecosphere that we talked about. So remember, we talked about the atmosphere, we talked about the hydrosphere, and we talked about the lithosphere. So cycling of matter is when we're talking about movement of materials through those different parts of the ecosphere. So when we discuss the cycling of matter and how fast it occurs, we talk about fast cycling and we talk about slow cycling. So we're just going to define what that means. So rapid cycling occurs when the transfer of matter is relatively quick, and we'll take a look at a few examples of that on the next slide. And remember, this says relatively quick. So sometimes it can happen literally in seconds. Sometimes, it might be days or weeks, but it's a relatively quick. When we, so this would be an example of this would be the transfer of energy or matter from the producer to the consumer. So as a consumer, like a deer or whatever, eats grass or eats leaves or whatever, then we have that transfer of matter from the plant to the consumer. And as the deer digests that plant matter, that's going to be a relatively quick or rapid conversion of matter. Slow cycling, on the other hand, occurs when the transfer of matter is very slow. And we're not talking weeks, we're not talking months, we're talking years, perhaps even millions of years. And so that matter is basically locked up, it is in a dormant state, and it's not available to other organisms for a very, very long time. Example of that would be fossil fuel deposits. So if you think of the fact that most of our planet is still ocean, so about 70% of our planet is still covered in ocean. On the ocean floor, we have fossil fuel deposits that have been there for literally millions and millions of years, and they're not extractable because they are in very deep on the ocean floor. It's not accessible to us in terms of harvesting those fossil fuels for human use, and so basically it's unattainable, and so they are there forever. Now, once fossil fuels are harvested and converted to materials like gasoline and burned in our cars, then of course that would be rapid cycling, right? Because as the engine of the car works and uses that gasoline, that's actually a very fast conversion of matter. But slow cycling takes a very, very long time. So when we talk about biogeochemical cycles, let's just break down that word. So bio, of course, means living. Geo, of course, means earth, okay? And then chemicals. So basically what this means is the cycling of materials through the living and the non-living, okay? Or the cycling of chemicals through the living and non-living components of the biosphere, or in other words, the biotic and the abiotic, right? Remember, biotic is all the living things and living relationships, and abiotic is all the non-living things, right? So biotic, of course, most kids think of the animals, the plants, bacteria, protists, all of those things, the fungi, all of those things that are living things. But keep in mind that when we talk about the biotic components, we're also talking about the relationships between living things, okay? So consumers, producers, predators, eating prey, those kinds of things as well. So it's not just the biotic and abiotic, or sorry, not just the living things, but the relationships between those living things. So some of the biogeochemical cycles that are prominent in our program of studies are the carbon-oxygen cycle. Quite often the carbon-oxygen cycle is just called the carbon cycle, so you may have seen that before in your previous studies. We have the sulfur cycle, we have the nitrogen cycle, and then we have the phosphorus cycle. Listen, all of these are prominent in the program of studies. They're all fair game in terms of unit exams and district exams. The carbon oxygen cycle is one that is very prominent in the news these days because this is the one that is very highly associated with climate change. Okay, so obviously, very relevant topic in terms of how these materials are cycled through the ecosphere. So when we talk about the carbon oxygen cycle, these are concepts that you've probably heard of before, but we're just going to kind of review the main piece of it. So remember that carbon atoms are central to every atom that is organic. Okay, so all organic molecules have that carbon backbone, and there's two basic reactions that we've already studied that allow for carbon and oxygen to be incorporated into living things, and both of these would be considered to be rapid cycling. So photosynthesis in animals that are, or pardon me, organisms that are capable of producing their own food, primarily plants. And then, of course, cellular respiration. And remember, cellular respiration will occur in all living things as they convert stored glucose into ATP for metabolic processes. So what I want you to think about in terms of this diagram is, do the circled processes add or remove carbon to the atmosphere? And so we again kind of see this cycle, and so we're just talk about this graphic a little bit. So of course the sun drives the carbon oxygen cycle because the sun is necessary for that process of photosynthesis. And so again, think about whether photosynthesis actually adds or removes carbon from the atmosphere. So as plants undergo photosynthesis, they actually remove CO2 from the atmosphere in order to undergo those light dependent reactions. And so plants are actually really good for the planet in terms of keeping CO2 levels low. As organisms decay, so if we kind of just continue, so when this plant dies or an animal dies, then and they decompose, that will actually add carbon to the soil, etc. And dead organisms and waste products, so that would be like feces and other types of organic matter, they will actually eventually become potentially part of fossils and fossil fuels over time. And remember, that is going to be a slow cycling process. Now, one of the other things here that, of course, is very prominent in discussions on climate change today is this one here. So auto and factory emissions. So automobile exhaust, factory emissions are a huge contributor to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And anytime you're burning a fossil fuel, it doesn't really matter if it's a product of petroleum like gasoline or if it's coal. Anytime you're burning a fossil fuel, which is a carbon-based fuel, you're going to end up putting a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere. And then, of course, the plants are capable of taking some of that CO2 out of the atmosphere. But of course, the problem is the amount of CO2 is very high in relation to the amount that's actually being taken out of the atmosphere. So we're ending up with an accumulation of that CO2 in the atmosphere. Other contributors of CO2 are animal cellular respiration and plant cellular respiration. So of course, any organism that undergoes cellular respiration is also going to put CO2 back into the atmosphere. But historically, the amount of CO2 that's put into the atmosphere by humans, by animals, by plants, all of those things, all of that CO2 from cellular respiration usually was taken care of by photosynthesis. So there is a balance there in terms of the cycle because the carbon dioxide was used by the plants in turn, and they kind of kept the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere relatively reasonable. Of course, today, the issue, of course, is that the CO2 levels are very, very high, and that is what climate change scientists believe is leading to climate change. So in terms of the carbon oxygen cycle, we're going to take a look at a few of those things that would be considered to be rapid cycling of carbon versus slow cycling of carbon. So if we look at the rapid cycling piece, this would include things like forest fires. Obviously, forest fires are a huge issue right now globally, Australia, California, etc. And when forest fires burn, remember there's a lot of stored carbon in trees, right? So trees are mostly carbon, they're living things. We are all mostly carbon. And when forest fires occur on a very large scale, that releases a huge amount of carbon dioxide, among other chemicals, into the atmosphere very, very quickly. Decomposition, remember this is the breakdown of organic matter, primarily by bacteria. Okay, so bacteria are the biggest kind of group of decomposers, but you can also have like things like fungi, and some species of worms that are going to be decomposers as well. But primarily it's bacteria. So decomposition happens fairly quickly. If you think of your composting pail thing that you have these days in the city, you put your little compost stuff in your little green bin, and it actually starts to kind of decompose and get like really yucky really quickly. And that's because this is rapid cycling. So as bacteria actually break down organic matter, CO2 is released as a waste product into the atmosphere as well. Cellular respiration, we talked about already, so that's the mechanism by which your body is going to convert stored energy in the form of glucose into ATP. And as we go through the processes involved in cellular respiration, CO2 is released along the way, right? Primarily in that Krebs cycle situation. So photosynthesis is also rapid cycling, but that is the opposite of cell resp. So photosynthesis is going to take CO2 away from the atmosphere as opposed to putting it in. So keep in mind that when we talk about rapid versus slow cycling, we're talking about the movement of carbon through the ecosphere, right? So it can be putting it in to the atmosphere or taking it away. Burning of fossil fuels, so we talked about burning coal, we talked about burning gasoline. Anytime we burn fossil fuels, that puts CO2 into the atmosphere. And remember, the primary sources of that are automobiles, traditional automobiles, not electric ones, and the industrial processes, right? Because a lot of times industry will use petroleum, it will use coal for energy. And then the last one on here that is considered to be rapid cycling is deforestation. And that, of course, is large scale destruction of forests in a short period of time. Okay, so deforestation isn't like cutting down a Christmas tree occasionally, it's large scale removal of trees from an area. And of course, sometimes kids are like, well, how does that pertain or how does that relate to the carbon cycle? Well, it's because the fewer trees you have, right, on the planet, the less CO2 can actually be taken from the atmosphere for photosynthesis. So it all kind of contributes to that buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere. In terms of slow cycling, we have a couple of things that we call carbon sinks. Okay, so, and it's spelled like the kitchen sink. Okay, so carbon sink. And of course, what it means is that the carbon is actually sunk into these particular areas for a very long period of time. So forests are considered to be carbon sinks because the carbon isn't released until the tree burns or the tree dies and is decomposed, right? So it's called a sink because that carbon is stored there during the lifetime of the tree. The other one is fossil fuel deposits. And in fact, the largest carbon sink is actually on the ocean floor. So in the previous slide, we kind of talked about how 70% of the ocean is still covered in ocean. And on the ocean floor, that's where most of the fossil fuel deposits actually are on the planet. And so that actually is considered to be the world's largest carbon sink because those fossil fuels that are still on the ocean floor are just sitting there. They're not being cycled into the atmosphere or any of the components of the biosphere. The next one is weathering, and sometimes kids get weathering and erosion confused. Weathering is the breakdown, erosion is the movement, and erosion quite often is used to replace the word weathering, but they're actually two different things. So weathering means over time as wind and water and sand kind of wear away on rocks or rock beds and make them into smaller components. That's weathering. And so erosion is when wind or bodies of water actually move those weathered components, those rocks, that debris or whatever, to a different location. Okay, so weathering is slow. It's not something that happens super fast. And sometimes kids are like, well, if rock is being weathered, how does that affect the carbon oxygen cycle? Well, it kind of just depends on what we're talking about with respect to weathering. So not all weathering of all rock is going to contribute to the carbon oxygen cycle, but some does. It just depends on its composition. So as we said in the previous slide, decomposition is a very important part of the carbon cycle. And by definition, decomposition is the breakdown of organic matter. And in doing so, releasing organic nutrients into the soil for reuse. So the important thing here is that decomposition only occurs when we're talking about organic material. So this is why things like styrofoam cups, for example, will sit in landfills for literally hundreds and hundreds of years because decomposers cannot break down inorganic material like that. There's some materials that can be broken down through by the sun, some plastics, for example, that are inorganic, but those aren't decomposers that are doing that, okay? That's the radiation. So that's the first important piece. The role of decomposers is very, very important in terms of our ecosystems because they actually release nutrients into the soil for reuse. So as bacteria and fungi, etc., do their decomposition thing, they actually put nutrients into the soil for other organisms like plants to use. So organisms that act as decomposers are bacteria, fungi, earthworms, and insects. Keep in mind that bacteria by far are the largest group of decomposers, okay? The other thing to remember too is that fungi are not plants. Fungi are in their own separate kingdom. They are actually consumers, okay? So fungi will break down materials as well. This is probably a new term for you guys. It's detritus. And detritus is the leftover remains of organisms that are not necessarily always broken down. Okay, so but usually broken down by decomposers. So that includes the carcass, any excreted waste like feces, for example, any other organic fragments like hooves, etc., anything like that. So detritus is just kind of the remains of a dead organism. Fossil fuels we kind of talked about already, but fossil fuels are formed when this detritus is placed under intense pressure and intense heat, literally for millions of years, resulting in those fossil fuel reserves, primarily on the ocean floor. And so that can include coal deposits, that can include crude oil, which is oil before it's been refined into a usable form, and it can also include natural gas. So all of those things are fossil fuels, and all of those things, when they are stored in those carbon sinks on the ocean floor, for example, stay there for a really long time, but when they're harvested and burned, then they release CO2 into the atmosphere. I'm not going to spend too much time on the greenhouse effect because I know you guys have studied this multiple times during your science education, but it is important to distinguish between the greenhouse effect and the enhanced greenhouse effect. So the greenhouse effect is considered to be a normal natural phenomenon. In fact, it's what sustains life on our planet. If there were no greenhouse effect at all, then we would basically be a frozen planet everywhere, and that would really limit the amount of life that we could actually sustain here in terms of diversity. So the greenhouse effect is a normal process by which some of the sun's heat is trapped in the earth as opposed to radiated off into space. So since the beginning of life on our planet, there's always been a layer of greenhouse gases that has helped trap some of the sun's energy in our atmosphere so that the earth can remain habitable. Oh, it looks like the top was cut off my planet there. Oh, that's okay. And so that is a normal thing. It is a good thing because it's, like I said, what helps us to sustain a habitable planet. If all of the sun's energy were radiated back off into space, we would not have anywhere near the diversity that we have. So the greenhouse effect is normal, and it actually is a good thing. So it warms up the atmosphere, and that sustains life on the planet. Now, like we said, though, the enhanced greenhouse effect, so there's a little bit of a difference there. So the enhanced greenhouse effect is what we're experiencing right now. So this means that there are too many greenhouse gases that are accumulating. So this layer of greenhouse gases is getting thicker and thicker, and as a result, more and more of the sun's energy is actually being trapped in our atmosphere as opposed to being radiated off into space. And so that is what is believed to be the culprit that is leading to the climate change that we are experiencing on our planet today. So greenhouse effect is normal, it is good. Enhanced greenhouse effect is when that layer of greenhouse gases is getting too thick and too much of the sun's energy is actually being trapped here, and that is what is believed to be leading to climate change. So greenhouse gases, most of us usually think of CO2 as a greenhouse gas, and that's always what comes to mind because that's what is produced by the burning of fossil fuels. But CO2 is not the only greenhouse gas. So water vapor, methane, nitrous oxide, ozone, chlorofluorocarbons, known as CFCs, those all contribute to the greenhouse and the enhanced greenhouse effect. I would say, though, that carbon dioxide is the one that is of most concern right now because as we burn fossil fuels, that is the one that seems to be accumulating the most rapidly in our atmosphere. Methane is primarily produced by cattle. Okay, so remember we talked before about cattle having that anaerobic bacteria in their guts, and as they actually digest their food and the bacteria do their thing, the cow, when it farts, actually gets rid of a whole bunch of methane. And so cattle are considered themselves through their metabolic processes to be a contributor to the enhanced greenhouse effect as well. So there's a good video here that I suggest that you watch on the greenhouse effect just to kind of bring all those pieces together. Okay, but obviously this relates to the carbon oxygen cycle because of the carbon. So the next cycle that we're going to talk about is the sulfur cycle. The sulfur cycle also has an atmospheric component, just like the carbon oxygen cycle does, but there are some significant differences. Obviously, we're talking about sulfur as opposed to carbon and oxygen, but some of the components are similar. So what I want you to look at in terms of the diagram here is you can see the factories here, right? And so one thing important to remember is the most significant contributor to sulfur in the atmosphere. Okay, so here's our SO2 there, is industrial processes. Okay, so yeah, cars and whatever too a little bit, but it is primarily industrial processes. And this is why in Eastern Canada, there's always been more of a problem with acid rain than in Western Canada, because of course, along that US Canadian border there, historically a lot of automobile plants and factories, and so acid rain typically historically has been a much bigger problem in Eastern Canada as opposed to the West because we just don't have the same factory base in Western Canada. The other thing in Western Canada, interestingly, that also protects us is our rock layers in our sedimentary rock layers in Western Canada are primarily limestone. And limestone, when acid precipitation actually hits the limestone, it neutralizes it. So limestone actually is basic and it will neutralize the acid as the acid falls. So that also offers us some protection in terms of the effects of the acid rain. So talking about acid rain, what actually is that and why is it problematic? Plants actually require sulfur. It's considered to be a nutrient that plants need for growth, but they actually take this in through the soil. Okay, so sulfur is not a bad thing in and of itself. It's something that is necessary for plant growth. And the soil has sulfur because as bacteria decompose and break organic matter down, remember sulfur is part of proteins, part of amino acids, and so it will release sulfur into the soil for plants to use. However, through industrial processes, what ends up happening is the sulfur, instead of being in the ground where plants can use it, etc., it is released into the atmosphere through those industrial processes. And what ends up happening, of course, is you'll notice up here it says CO2, it doesn't, or SO2 rather, it doesn't say just sulfur. And what ends up happening is the sulfur will combine with water vapor, and what ends up happening is it actually forms sulfuric acid, which I know you guys know from chemistry is a very acidic compound. And as the sulfuric acid accumulates in the form of clouds, okay, and then we have, of course, precipitation. If that pH of that precipitation is low, then it is considered to be acid rain. Okay, so when the pH is lower than normal rainwater, that can have devastating effects on aquatic life and plant life. So if we take a look over here, the wind can also carry that acid rain in the form of clouds before it actually falls to different parts of the world. And so what ends up happening is trees cannot withstand that acidic precipitation and bringing that acidic water up into their roots, and it actually kills forests. And so if we look at our diagram down here, this is the after effect of too much acid rain in terms of plant life. The other thing that it affects is aquatic life. So if you think of like fish and amphibians, etc., in bodies of water, they are very detrimentally affected by drops in pH in their water. And this is particularly true for fish eggs, baby fish, and frog eggs and tadpoles. So in their, the younger organisms are devastated by drops in pH, especially when they happen relatively quickly. Okay, so the takeaway here is the biggest problem with the sulfur cycle is by burning fossil fuels, primarily through industrial processes, a lot of sulfur is being released into the atmosphere, combining with water, and then falling down to the earth in the form of a very acidic precipitation, which has catastrophic effects sometimes on living things. So taking a look at some of the rapid versus slow cycling processes in the sulfur cycle, some of them are similar to the carbon cycle because we're talking about burning fossil fuels, and some of them are different. So conversion of sulfur by bacteria, so like we talked about with decomposition, we'll get sulfur put back into the soil. This is actually a good thing though, because remember, in turn, the plants are going to actually use sulfur, and then when herbivores, including ourselves, when we eat plants, that's the way we get sulfur that is necessary for composition of amino acids and proteins and DNA and that kind of stuff, right? So this piece is good. So bacteria, plants take up that sulfur, herbivores and omnivores eat plants, and that's how we get sulfur as well. Decomposition, we talked about that already. Combustion of fossil fuels, so burning fossil fuels, particularly those industrial processes. One that we didn't see last time was volcanoes. Now, depending on the part of the world that you live in, this may or may not be a significant factor. We don't have a lot of volcanoes here on the surface. Most volcanoes are actually on the ocean floor, but in parts of the world where there are active volcanoes, this can result in a very rapid input of sulfur into the atmosphere when a volcano actually erupts. Okay, so it just depends on the situation. And then acid deposition, this would be what we talked about with the acid precipitation, so the acid rain, acidic snow, etc., and how that impacts plant life and aquatic life equally. Fossil fuel formation, again, that's a slow cycling piece. Geological uplift and weathering are kind of connected to one another. Geological uplift is when the Earth's crust actually becomes disrupted. So this can be because of an earthquake, for example. And so when the rock layers actually get shifted and pushed up, and then sometimes the weathering will result in the sulfur being released from those rock layers. Okay, but definitely you can see that the rapid cycling piece is very, very impactful when it comes to the input of sulfur into the atmosphere. Sometimes good, conversion of bacteria and decomposition, etc., and sometimes not so good, like that acid rain piece. The nitrogen cycle is really, really important because this is one of the ones that is going to bring in a whole bunch of terminology that you haven't seen before in your science studies, okay? And some of the terminology that's on this slide and the next slide is very, very important in terms of your exams, okay? So your unit exams, potentially the district exam, because this one is very, very prominent in the program of studies. So when we talk about the nitrogen cycle, obviously nitrogen is a very, very important element. Nitrogen is necessary for nucleic acids. Nitrogen is necessary for proteins, and nitrogen is one of the top three in terms of plant nutrients. So when we talk about plant nutrients, we kind of have NPK, so nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are kind of considered to be the top three most important components for plant growth and development, etc. So nitrogen is very, very important in terms of life on the planet. And so we're going to talk about how nitrogen actually cycles through the ecosphere. We obtain nitrogen for the construction of these molecules from plants. So humans can't just absorb nitrogen from the air, even though we know that nitrogen is the solvent in air. It's the most prominent component of air, but we can't just absorb that through our skin or, inhale it, because our lungs are capable of the, movement of the oxygen, not the nitrogen into our bloodstream for composition. So plants will take nitrogen from the soil for growth, and then in turn, very similar to sulfur, when living things eat plants, then that's how they get nitrogen to help build those molecules, protein and nucleic acids, etc. So if we look at our little diagram here, an important thing to remember about the nitrogen cycle is that this one also has an atmospheric component in terms of nitrogen gas, right? So we know that. We know that air is mostly nitrogen. So the thing about nitrogen gas, though, is that plants, even though they're capable of bringing in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and getting rid of oxygen as they go through their metabolic processes, through their little pores, through those stomata on their leaves, plants are not actually capable of taking nitrogen in from the atmosphere to help sustain life, okay, and build their own proteins and nucleic acids. They actually have to be able to take nitrogen from the soil. So the problem is, though, is that atmospheric nitrogen, nitrogen gas, is not a usable form of nitrogen for any living thing. So it has to be converted into a usable form before the plants can actually use it. Okay, so this is where the new terminology comes in. So if we follow this line here, okay, we actually have this very, very special type of bacteria called nitrogen fixing bacteria. And I want you to think about what fixing means. Remember, we talked about the carbon cycle and carbon fixation, and this is nitrogen fixation. Okay, so, and then it says in the root nodules of legumes. It's like, what? Well, legumes are things like peas, lentils, okay, that kind of stuff, alfalfa, clover. Those are all considered to be legumes. And if we look at our little graphic here, legumes are actually little nodules they're found the little nodules on the roots of legumes is where those nitrogen fixing bacteria are found rather. So we have these little kind of nodules, okay, these little pockets, okay, little nodules, and inside those little nodules are actually these little nitrogen fixing bacteria. So not all plants are capable of this, okay, only plants that have these specialized little root nodules with that bacteria in them are capable of nitrogen fixation, okay? So we have nitrogen fixation in those little nodules, and we also have nitrogen fixing bacteria in the soil as well, okay? So these nitrogen fixing bacteria exist naturally in the soil. They also exist in those little root nodules that we find in those pea plants and clover plants, etc. Okay, so what does that actually mean if the little legume nodules and bacteria and everything, what does that actually mean in terms of nitrogen fixation? Well, what nitrogen fixation actually means is it's the conversion of atmospheric nitrogen, so that nitrogen gas, into NH4, okay, ammonium. And that process is called ammonification, okay? So the conversion of nitrogen gas into ammonium, NH4, is the process that is completed by nitrogen fixing bacteria in those little root nodules and in the soil bacteria. So the other thing to remember here, though, kiddos, is that this NH4 is still not usable in terms of the plants. Okay, so the plants still can't actually use that for metabolic processes. So what ends up happening then is we have another kind of bacteria called nitrifying bacteria, and nitrifying bacteria will actually convert the ammonium into nitrites and nitrates. Okay, so notice that. So we have nitrites and nitrates. Okay, nitrites and nitrates. So this process is called nitrification. So the first process, ammonification, conversion of atmospheric nitrogen into ammonium. Second process, nitrification, which is the conversion of the ammonium into nitrites and nitrates. Now, what's important about the nitrites and the nitrates is that this is the form of nitrogen plants can actually use. They can actually take this up into their root systems and they can actually use it for metabolic processes. So that's why that piece is very, very significant. So then what ends up happening is, in order to keep this cycle going, we need a process by which the nitrates and the nitrites are going to be converted back to atmospheric nitrogen. And that's where the denitrifying bacteria come in. So think of that for a minute. If nitrifying bacteria changes it from ammonium to nitrites, denitrifying puts it back into the atmosphere as nitrogen gas. So there's the cycle piece, all right? So the assimilation just means that now that we have nitrites and nitrates, the plants can actually use that, okay, for metabolic processes. And then you'll notice we also have the decomposers, and that just means that, like, when this squirrel dies, okay, decomposers also can go through ammonification, okay, so they can also contribute to ammonium, or the conversion of nitrogen, or conversion of organic matter into ammonium, okay. So on our next slide, we're going to define these terms in word form as opposed to just kind of looking at the graphic, and see if we can piece all of it together. All right, so here's the slide I promised with the actual word definitions of these different types of bacteria, etc. So takeaway here, there are 4 different types of bacteria involved in converting nitrogen through the nitrogen cycle. So first of all, there's decomposers, which are going to break down detritus and release ammonium into the soil. Okay, so remember, decomposers do this as well. So when an animal dies or a plant dies, and primarily bacteria or fungi come in and actually decompose the material, that will convert and release ammonium into the soil. Now remember, ammonium is not a usable form of nitrogen for plants, okay? So this is just part of the process, because plants can only use nitrites, nitrates in terms of nutrients in order for their metabolic processes. So the next super important thing is the nitrogen fixing bacteria. So the nitrogen fixing bacteria does the same thing that the decomposers do, except they are taking atmospheric nitrogen and converting it to ammonium. Okay, so the end result is the same. So decomposers and nitrogen fixing bacteria put ammonium into the soil, but decomposers, it's from detritus, or dead organic matter, and the nitrogen fixing bacteria, it's from nitrogen gas. So remember, nitrogen fixing means taking atmospheric nitrogen and then fixing it into a compound that is no longer atmospheric, right? So remember, these nitrogen fixing bacteria live in those nodules of those little legumes like peas and beans, etc. And farmers will actually rotate their crops. So instead of planting like wheat all the time or corn all the time, they'll actually cycle in a few crops of legumes, because the legumes actually replenish the soil, and this is called crop rotation. So the legumes actually help enrich the soil and put nitrogen back into the soil, as opposed to just taking it out over and over again, because then the plants, the crop yield just won't be great if you keep depleting the soil of the nitrogen. So nitrifying bacteria, okay, so this is the next step. This is going to take the ammonium that the decomposers, like the bacteria and the fungi that are in the soil, and the nitrogen fixing bacteria produced, okay, so decomposers and nitrogen fixing bacteria produce that ammonium. And then the nitrifying bacteria, which lives naturally in the soil, okay, so that's one important thing, is we have this nitrifying bacteria in the soil, and it will actually convert the ammonium into nitrites or nitrates. And remember, what's significant about the NO2 and NO3 is that these are the forms of plant nutrients that plants can actually use. Plants cannot use atmospheric nitrogen. They cannot use ammonium. It has to be in the nitrite or nitrate form. Okay, so step 1 is the ammonification, which the decomposers and the nitrogen fixing bacteria do. Step 2 is the nitrifying, which is the conversion of the ammonium into nitrites or nitrates. And then step 3 is the denitrifying bacteria. So this is the opposite process. Nitrifying is from ammonium to nitrites and nitrates. Denitrifying is the opposite. So that's taking the nitrites and nitrates and converting it back into atmospheric nitrogen. And so the cycle continues. Okay, so these 4 terms are super important Very, very prominent in the program of studies, particularly the difference between the nitrogen fixing, the nitrifying, and the denitrifying bacteria in terms of their processes. Okay, so nitrogen fixing is ammonification. Okay, ammonification. Nitrifying is nitrification, and denitrifying is denitrification. Okay, so make sure you understand where these bacteria, etc., are found and what they do in terms of the nitrogen cycle. So the last cycle that we're going to talk about is the phosphorus cycle. And remember what we said about phosphorus. Phosphorus is one of the big three in terms of plant nutrients. So nitrogen, super important. Phosphorus, super important, and potassium, super important, so NPK. Now those are the macronutrients for plants. Of course, plants need other nutrients in smaller amounts. We call those micronutrients, but NPK are the big three. So we don't really discuss potassium in terms of the cycles because it's not related to the cycles for the most part, but the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle, of course, are important in terms of those plant nutrients. So one thing that's different about the phosphorus cycle as opposed to all of the other cycles, the carbon-oxygen, the nitrogen cycle, and the sulfur cycle, is that phosphorus does not have an atmospheric phase. Okay, so all of the other compounds, right? We have carbon dioxide gas, we have the nitrogen gas, we have the sulfuric acid that condenses in the clouds. Okay, so all of those have the atmospheric component. Phosphorus does not. Okay, so phosphorus, while it is an essential nutrient for all living things, is found in the sediment or in the soil. Okay, it does not have an atmospheric piece, right? So, and you guys know that from chemistry anyway. So phosphorus is an essential element in terms of plant life and animal life because it's required to make nucleic acids. It's required to make ATP, which of course is that essential metabolic energy molecule. It's also required for healthy bones, healthy teeth, okay, etc. So phosphorus is very, very important for all living things. We obtain phosphorus from plants, okay, so again, there's no way that organisms can just manufacture their own phosphorus. Plants have to take phosphorus from the soil, and consumers have to get phosphorus from their diet. Okay, so primarily from plant matter. So herbivores, omnivores get phosphorus from eating plant matter. Soil-bound phosphorus is accumulated through a process called sedimentation. So that just means the accumulation of phosphorus in the soil. And then phosphate runoff is a really, really important kind of concept in terms of why the phosphorus cycle, if it gets out of control, can be problematic. So sometimes kids are like, well, this is phosphorus cycle is good because, you know, plants die and animals die, phosphorus goes into the soil, then plants use it again, and then we eat plants and we get our phosphorus. Yeah, the phosphorus cycle is a natural cycle and it is a good cycle. The problem is that when we get too much phosphate into water systems because of detergents and fertilizers, primarily from agriculture, the end result is too much phosphorus in the water systems, and that can be problematic. And I'm sure you guys have probably heard of algal bloom before, and that is the problem that we're going to be talking about. So in terms of fertilizers, this is primarily from agricultural processes. So when farmers actually use fertilizers to grow crops, and even in animal agriculture, so you have cattle and their feces end up kind of, you know, water draining off when it rains into water systems. Okay, what that ends up doing is putting a lot of phosphorus into aquatic systems when it rains. So that's the runoff piece. Okay, and then when we talk about detergents, we're talking about even things like laundry detergent. Okay, so unless you're using a phosphate-free detergent, which most of them are not, every time the washing machine drains or you do dishes or the dishwasher drains or whatever, those detergents, which have phosphate in them because it's a cleaning agent, ends up going into the water systems, okay? And, you know, a certain amount of phosphorus in the water systems isn't problematic, but when we get too much of those phosphate-based substances from fertilizers and detergents into water systems, it can be very problematic for aquatic ecosystems. So our last slide in our little synopsis is about what happens when the phosphorus cycle runs amok Okay, so when there actually ends up being too much phosphorus or phosphates from detergents, from agricultural processes into water systems. So whether that be the lakes or rivers, etc. And a couple of graphics here you can see, I'm sure, at some point in time, you've probably seen this nasty green slimy stuff in lakes or in ponds of water. And this is actually an overabundance of algae. Okay. And then if lakes in Alberta, algae's been a problem over the last few years. And so sometimes you might see notices at different lakes not to go swimming because of algal bloom, which means, again, that overproduction of algae. Too much algae can cause swimmers itch. It can make people sick. So if the algae is out of control in water systems, sometimes there'll be like a warning not to go swimming, etc. And then in our other slide here, you can see that we have the death of fish. And so when we get these algal blooms in water systems, the end result can be significant morbidity or death of the things that live in the water systems, and it's because the end result is lack of oxygen. Okay, so when we get too much phosphate runoff, okay, so agricultural fertilizer, detergents, all of that stuff being washed into the water systems by drainage or when it rains, etc. This can lead to an excess of what we call algal blooms. So algal blooms is an overgrowth of algae. So sometimes kids are like, well, having this phosphorus or phosphates in the water systems is good because that's an essential nutrient for plants, and so plants are going to use that phosphate. And it's like, yeah, that's true to an extent. The problem is that algae has a very, very fast life cycle. So algae will replicate super quickly, but they also die very quickly too. And what ends up happening when you have too much algae, like you do here, is that bacteria, because bacteria, of course, are decomposers, and anytime you have dead organic matter, you have detritus accumulating, and in this case, it would be the dead algae, okay? You're going to get an abundance of bacteria that are there, present, and decomposing. Now, the problem with that is the bacteria use up oxygen, and yeah, plants will make oxygen, but when you get a significant amount of algae in a body of water, you actually are using up way more oxygen than the plants are actually making. So the end result of an algal bloom is that you have a significant drop in dissolved oxygen in the water. Okay, so whether it's the lake or the pond or the river or whatever, you end up with a significant decrease in dissolved oxygen. Now, the problem with not having enough dissolved oxygen is it makes the water inhabitable for aquatic life. And when we talk about aquatic life, we're talking about your higher end vertebrates. So we're talking about fish, okay? We're talking about amphibians like frogs, salamanders, etc. Okay? These types of organisms need significant levels of dissolved oxygen. So when you get to the point that it's like this down here, where we see these dead fish, you're going to have things like mosquito larvae. You're going to have leeches, okay, maybe some other species of flatworms, but you're not going to have any vertebrates in there anymore, because vertebrates require, fish, amphibians, etc., require high levels of dissolved oxygen to survive. So the end result of an algal bloom, if it is out of control, is that it will result in what we call eutrophication. And that's an important term. Eutrophication is the process by which an algal bloom or some other type of event, but in this case, we're talking about the algal blooms, results rather in a significant decrease in dissolved oxygen levels, and it makes the water no longer habitable for those amphibians and fish. Now, when there is that rapid decomposition and those bacteria using up huge amounts of oxygen in a very short time, and that kills off most of the aquatic life, we call that a dead zone. Okay, so that is the issue to think about in connection with the phosphorus cycle. That's what's prominent in our program of studies, is how those phosphates draining into the water systems can result in algal blooms and how that impacts living things.